Senator Wright.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise to speak on the Medical Research Future Fund Bill 2015 and the Medical Research Future Fund Consequential Amendments Bill 2015. And this is a bill which provides for the establishment of the Medical Research Future Fund, the MRFF, as it's colloquially known. And I want to put on the record, or reiterate essentially, what the Leader of the Australian Greens, my colleague Dr Richard Di Natale, has said, and that is that we are keen to support health and medical research in Australia, and we welcome the intention of the MRFF that the fund's strategies and priorities will foster innovation and translation. The MRFF, the MRFF, Medical Research Future Fund, is a transformative initiative that will provide significant funding in Australia and support innovative work to bridge the gap between pure research and the application of research results in the field. Now, it's only fairly recently, I suppose, in my career that I came to hear the phrase translational research. I don't have a scientific background as such, although I'm very interested in science. I come more from a humanities and legal background, so I hadn't actually heard that expression until I met a very impressive mental health practitioner, Dr Jayshree Kulkarni, who's associated with the Monash Alfred Psychiatry Research Centre, and talked to me about the importance of having translational research, particularly in relation to mental health research. And so, as the Greens spokesperson for mental health, I'm going to be making a particular case in speaking to this bill about the desirability of having much more dedicated and directed funding for research into mental health. And I think it's not difficult at all, if you look at the evidence, to make the case for that. Let's go back to what we know about mental health prevalence, or mental ill health, I should say, prevalence in Australian society in 2015, and that is that mental illness is the third highest cause of disability and premature death in Australia. And in fact, it's very well accepted, I think, that 1 in 4 of us will experience some form of mental illness or mental ill health in our lifetimes. We also know, and it's not really contested, I think, that mental illness costs the Australian community billions of dollars a year in both direct and indirect costs. And of course, recently, the chair of the National Mental Health Commission, Professor Alan Fels, was on the record talking about the incredible cost to the Australian community, both in terms of personal cost in lives lost and productive lives lost and participation, but also the financial cost to the community in lost productivity that flows from mental ill health in Australia. So we know that it costs us all a great deal of money as well as quality of life. In fact, there's report after report after report that establishes the cost of untreated and undertreated mental ill health in Australia, but a national Australian survey of people living with psychotic illness in 2010, which was overseen by SANE, the organisation SANE, found that for people with psychotic illness, just as one example, education achievement was low. 78% of those people were unemployed, 16% were either homeless or living in supported group housing, and 74% were single. So it doesn't take much imagination to understand the incredible loss of productivity just in that subgroup of people who experience mental ill health in Australia. And the fundamental problem is that the treatment of mental disorders in Australia has not progressed sufficiently. I think our awareness of the prevalence of mental ill health has progressed. Our understanding about the need to get adequate treatment has progressed, but in fact the treatment of mental disorders has not progressed at the same rate, particularly when we compare that with treatments of other illnesses which once were much more, I suppose, debilitating than that perhaps are now, illnesses like cancer and heart disease. because, once decades ago, a diagnosis of most forms of cancer would have been a terminal diagnosis, and of course with the amazing treatments and research that's occurred in those intervening decades, there's a lot more hope for people who experience those sorts of illnesses. So despite the fact that there is such a huge financial loss from untreated and undertreated mental illness in Australia, only about 3.5% of Australia's total medical research budget, for instance, was spent on research into depression and psychosis. Depression, a very prevalent mental ill health condition in Australia, and psychosis, while less prevalent, with very, very debilitating and life-affecting consequences for people. So basic science research is important, of course, but speaking to Dr. Kulkarni and others, I have come to understand the absolute importance of having that research then translated forward into the development of new and effective treatments for people with mental illness, so that practically speaking there is absolutely important hope offered to those people. Early intervention is necessary, but its impacts are only as good as the treatments that are available. And of course service reform is also important, and there's a huge debate and conversation and dialogue going on at the moment in Australia, particularly on the back of the most recent National Mental Health Commission review report as to how we improve service provision. But ultimately services will be impotent without new treatments to deliver to sufferers. So there's an absolute need to have better mental health research and translational research to provide the treatments that are needed. And I was interested to see that there was a very impressive and interesting article in the Medical Journal of Australia that was published in 2011, and the authors of that article were like a who's who of some of the most influential thinkers and practitioners in the mental health space in Australia. So we had Helen Christensen of the Black Dog Institute, Philip Batterham, Ian Hickey, Professor Pat McGorry, Philip Mitchell, and as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Jayshree Kulkarni, and they did some research into comparing funding for mental health research between 2001 and 2010. So they were really questioning whether or not the gap that we are aware of in relation to the proportion of the health research dollar that's going to mental health research had narrowed over that decade. And so they compared it with the research that was being done into other national health priority areas. And the findings of that research, and reported in that Medical Journal of Australia article, were really concerning and did in fact confirm the fact that most people know, that mental health research does receive lower levels of funding. So they started off by looking at particular illnesses like cardiovascular disease and cancer research, and they found that mental health research had received 9.5% of funding. Cardiovascular disease had received 21.7% of funding, and cancer research had received 14.9% of the funding. But when they actually made adjustments for the burden of disease and looked at things like, and this, forgive me for the acronym here, it's DALY, D-A-L-Y, but basically it's a way of trying to apportion the significance and the implications of particular illnesses and conditions on people's lives and functioning. So DALY stands for the attributable disability per life year. When they actually made adjustments for the burden of disease, they found that diabetes, asthma, cancer, arthritis and cardiovascular disease, all important and life-affecting conditions, of course, but they all received proportionately more research dollar per DALY, but per disability life year, than mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, psychosis, and so on. And that causes, obviously, those of us who are very aware of the prevalence and the effects of mental ill health on people in their daily lives, that causes us a great deal of concern. And in a sense, it actually, I suppose, reflects some kind of illogical way that we've developed our funding in the health system generally in relation to treatment of mental ill health. It's almost like we have some kind of a mind-body split where we privilege illnesses and conditions from the neck down perhaps more than we do illnesses and conditions which affect people from the head up. So mental health has traditionally always received and been neglected in terms of health funding dollars, and there's a sort of a common understanding that in terms of burden of disease generally and mental health funding, that while the burden of disease associated with mental ill health is about 13 to 14%, in fact the proportion of health spending that is dedicated and directed towards mental health funding is about half of that. It's about 6 to 7%. So for a long time, mental health advocates have been saying we need to double the funding that's available to meet the incredible unmet need throughout Australia. Those people who've been following the sorts of work I've been doing over the last 4 years as spokesperson for mental health for the Greens won't be surprised to know that will know that I have done a lot of work, particularly in relation to unmet mental illness and mental ill health need in rural areas of Australia. And so while the funding for burden of disease overall is about half what's needed, it's even less than that in rural areas, particularly when we acknowledge that 30% of Australians live in rural, regional and remote areas. We know that there's a great lack of services, there's a great lack of both community-based and clinical services. There's too few practitioners who are qualified living in those and working in those areas, and that's a real problem for country people. And unfortunately, we see the results of that in relation to the recent Garvan Institute report that came out last week, which showed that country people are 66% more likely to take their own lives. And that's just one example of the effect of that unfairness and that disproportion of funding in the system that doesn't flow on to people living in rural, regional and remote areas. Look, the Australian Greens are very, very clearly on the record calling for increased funding of mental health research. Indeed, after having spoken to Dr Kulkarni and been very impressed with a proposal that she brought to me in relation to a National Institute of Mental Illness Research, which would look at coordinating the research, and often wonderful, exciting research that's happening in different institutions across Australia, but with a need to coordinate that. The Australian Greens actually developed comprehensive and thorough policy to support more mental health research that we actually took to the 2013 federal election, having had it costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. We did that on the basis that we understood that there is a desperate need for the development of new treatments that offer hope, particularly for people who live with chronic and debilitating illnesses like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder. We need development of new treatments for mental illness. Similarly, people who experience depression, chronic depression, GPs and specialists need strongly to have tools in their toolkit that can actually offer people hope when they come to get that assistance that they need. On the basis of knowing that mental illness is the third highest cause of disability and premature death in Australia, and that it does already cost the Australian community billions of dollars, how could we argue with the idea that investing properly in appropriate research and translational research and treatments wouldn't be a good reward on that, good down payment on that investment. And so the Australian Greens came up with a proposal to invest $150 million over 3 years to establish a National Institute for Mental Illness Research as an overarching supervisory body for mental illness research in Australia. It was based on the well thought through proposal, and so that's still there. We're not talking about that today. We don't have the option to be promoting that, but I hope I've made the case for much more dedicated and significant funding for mental ill health and mental illness in terms of the funding, medical funding of research generally. And the Greens will be supporting this bill, but I would be putting in a particular plug that when decisions are being made about where that research should be funded, that mental health stops being a Cinderella area and actually gets the priority that it deserves.